The city was a symphony of life. The shouts from the marketplace blended with the measured tread of sandals on dusty paths. It was a rhythm as old as olive roots, a reliable pulse that had governed human endeavor for millennia. Everything seemed contained within the familiar geometry of the agora, the central square where commerce and discourse inevitably met. Here, life unfolded with practiced grace. Men debated civic law under cool marble colonnades, hands gesturing with the certainty of tradition. They spoke of glory earned on distant battlefields, of fortunes built through trade routes that stretched to the edges of the known world. This was the pinnacle of civilization, a tapestry woven from collective achievement and unwavering belief in established order. Yet, beneath this magnificent surface hummed something else, a low, almost imperceptible vibration. It was the restless energy of minds that saw patterns not just on the cobblestones, but within themselves. The comforts offered by the city were profound: community, law, predictable ritual. But these structures, for all their strength, sometimes felt too small to contain the restless expanse of the human spirit. Man had always been defined by his relations, his role in the family, his profession, his allegiance to a god or a polis. The self was less an inherent core and more a collection of titles and obligations. To be good meant upholding the expectations of others. Happiness meant achieving status within the group. But whispers began to gather. They were quiet conversations held under the shade of fig trees, moments when a man paused his routine journey simply to listen. These whispers suggested a radical notion. Perhaps the true measure of existence was not found in what one contributed to the whole, but in the singular experience of being oneself. It started subtly enough. A question posed over wine, a thought so simple it risked sounding ridiculous. Why must fulfillment be defined by external applause? Is the quiet integrity of a single day more valuable than the clamor of public victory? These questions challenged the very scaffolding upon which Athenian life was built, suggesting that identity might not be a borrowed garment, but something intrinsic, awaiting discovery. This burgeoning self-awareness felt dangerous. It threatened to unravel the neatly arranged social fabric. If every man decided that his deepest loyalty was first and foremost to his own inner understanding, to the pure rationality of his own judgment, then the great mechanisms of law, custom, and tradition might stall altogether. The initial resistance was palpable. People viewed this internal inquiry with suspicion, as if it were a contagious illness. Why examine the nature of virtue when one could simply perform virtue? Why question established wisdom when centuries of teachings offered sufficient comfort? This is the ground upon which philosophy must first plant its seed, not in the library or the lecture hall, but in the quiet corner of personal doubt. To realize that you might know less than you ever imagined, that was the revolutionary act. It demanded a turning inward, away from the cheering crowds, and towards the solitary echo of one's own mind. The world expected mastery over the outer realm, predicting harvests, winning battles, controlling rhetoric. But the greatest struggle, Socrates would later demonstrate with patient intensity, lay not across borders or against armies, but within the architecture of the human soul. The citizen who felt comfortable in the city was often deeply unaware of his own assumptions. He believed he knew what justice was. She thought she grasped piety. They were confident. And that confidence, built on unexamined certainty, was the first vulnerability to be exposed. For true wisdom does not come from accumulating answers, but from cultivating a profound and humbling capacity for questioning. It is a journey of perpetual skepticism applied not just to politics, but to one's own deepest beliefs. The foundations of the modern self are thus laid, recognizing that beneath the roles we play, son, citizen, merchant, there exists a core entity capable of reason. And that core entity, when properly awakened and disciplined, possesses the potential for an inner freedom far exceeding any earthly empire. The scent of dust and rosemary hung heavy in the air, a familiar perfume to the marketplace where life unfolded like an endless scroll. Here, under the shade of porticos, men discussed trade routes and political skirmishes. The world, at first glance, appeared perfectly ordered. People moved with purpose, vendors shouting prices, merchants bartering weights of grain, families weaving through the crowd in predictable patterns. This was the rhythm of the city, a comfort built over generations, an assurance that defined identity through roles. A potter was a citizen, a soldier, a protector, a mother, a pillar of the home. Our worth was measured by our place within this magnificent, established structure. To be good, one had to perform their designated role well. But even amidst the certainty of these ancient rhythms, something began to fray. A subtle current, too weak to be noticed by those focused on the day's profits or triumphs, started to whisper, whispers that questioned the very foundation of belonging. Could the name assigned to us by society truly capture the depth of who we were? If our value rested only on what we contributed to the collective, then what happened when contribution failed? When the potter's wheels stopped turning, or the soldier found himself idle in times of peace? The initial questioning was almost dismissed as a passing fancy, a rhetorical flourish among poets. But these murmurs gathered strength, growing into a persistent doubt that defied dismissal. They suggested that perhaps the source of our worth lay not in external achievement, the laurel wreath, the bulging purse, the family name, but deep within the quiet reservoir of self-awareness. This internal inquiry was dangerous. It threatened the entire edifice of civic life. If every man began to ask, "But am I enough? Am I good simply because I exist?" the established norms, built on unquestioning participation, would crumble into dust. True wisdom, it became apparent, did not arrive through public pronouncements or military victory parades. It was a journey that required a difficult turning inward, a deliberate cultivation of skepticism aimed at the most foundational assumptions of existence itself. The initial seeds of doubt, once planted, could not be ignored. They waited for an echo to amplify them. And then it arrived, like a fragmented rumor caught on the wind current between stalls. A conversation overheard in the shade of a fountain, its speakers' voices low, almost conspiratorial, as if afraid of the ears around them. It was not a debate about taxes or treaties. It was something stranger, more unsettling. One voice suggested that maybe, just maybe, the self mattered more than the collective narrative. Another hinted at an individual spirit whose value could not be quantified by bronze coinage or communal praise. These phrases were dissonant notes played against the steady harmony of accepted life. They planted a seed of doubt, so profound it felt physically unsettling. For those who had built their entire sense of meaning upon the reliability of others, upon shared purpose and tradition, this notion was nothing short of treasonous to the spirit. It suggested that the boundary between self and world was permeable, negotiable, perhaps even illusory. The first acknowledgement of this doubt required a specific kind of confrontation, a gentle, patient challenge. One man, whom we will call Socrates by association with his methods, began to question everyone he encountered. This was not a brawl. There were no raised voices or accusations thrown in anger. It was an inquiry, a slow, methodical examination posed with genuine curiosity. He would corner the acclaimed sophist who boasted of knowing justice, and ask, simply, "Tell me what you mean by knowing justice." Or he would speak to the general lauded for his wisdom, asking him only to define courage, leaving the man exposed in his own assumptions. The process was always gentle, but its effect was universally disorienting. Through these questions, they revealed a profound and startling truth shared by all, that the most confident people were often the most profoundly ignorant. They spoke eloquently about things they had never truly examined, assuming knowledge simply because it passed their lips. This unveiling of universal ignorance became the first crucial step toward self-possession. The struggle next moved beyond mere conversation and into a deep exploration of human behavior. We observed men caught in a frantic chase, a desperate attempt to control everything external to themselves. They writhed against the whims of fortune, cursed the unpredictability of rivals, desperately tried to shape the flow of opinion in the public square. It was a struggle to master the weather and the fickle disposition of man. Yet they were chasing shadows. Their profound attachment to what lay outside their immediate control, the perfect harvest, the enemy's downfall, the favor of the gods, was a source of continuous, exhausting misery. They spent their vital energies attempting to glue together things that nature had never intended to be joined. This unsustainable desire for external mastery was merely an illusion. It offered temporary relief, but guaranteed eternal disappointment. The turning point demanded not confrontation, but radical acceptance. A calm figure began to teach a radically different lesson. The master did not demand military feats or oratorical perfection. Instead, he pointed inward, guiding the student's attention away from the chaotic ocean of external events and toward the secure harbor within the self. He taught that true tranquility was not found in predicting perfect conditions, but in acknowledging the immutable law of change. It meant realizing the deep power inherent in saying, "This is beyond my reach." This specific illness, this passing misfortune, the actions of another person, these are matters for fate or others. My response to them, however, remains within my sphere. The challenge soon grew sharper. The philosopher stood at the precipice of personal ruin. He faced a choice that was devastatingly simple yet philosophically agonizing. Would he prioritize the acceptance and goodwill of his community, choosing temporary safety by submitting to public opinion, or would he uphold the rigorous demands of integrity, the commitment to truth found only through introspection, knowing that this path guaranteed disgrace or worse? The dilemma became a crucible. To fail here was not merely a social setback. It risked dissolving the very core of what he believed his life's meaning to be. The mentor then employed a powerful, invisible geometry in their teaching. He drew an invisible line, dividing reality into two impenetrable domains. On one side lay everything: the market price of olives, whether or not the Senate approves of his ideas, the health of his child, the sudden fall of an empire. These were things subject to chance, will, and external influence. But on the other side, this smaller, more defined space, lay only choice: my judgment, my reaction, my assent. The understanding was staggering in its simplicity. All my effort, all my energy, must be focused exclusively upon this sliver of internal freedom. This distinction solidified wisdom into a practical, actionable science. This led inevitably to the study of emotional detachment, not misunderstanding or coldness, but true freedom from destructive passion. We began to understand that when we suffered intensely, it was rarely due to the event itself. Rather, it stemmed from our judgment about the event. To lose everything was merely an occurrence. Suffering over the loss was a cognitive decision. The disciplined mind learned to observe those intense feelings: the sudden sting of grief, the blinding rage, as external visitors. They could be acknowledged without being obeyed. This emotional mastery allowed one to face deprivation or profound personal failure and remain anchored in a crystalline center of calm. The great shift occurred when philosophy ceased to be merely an abstract theory discussed under olive trees and began to redefine what constituted a good life altogether. The ancient definitions were tied irrevocably to external goods: reputation earned through war, power wielded by the Senate, comfort provided by wealth. But the disciplined student realized that these things were fragile props. The true measure of a noble existence was not built on what one possessed, but on how one chose to react when possessing nothing at all. Virtue, reasoning, courage, justice in thought became self-contained and indestructible. This profound realization carried an undeniable cost. Holding such unyielding conviction meant living perpetually outside the comfortable consensus. The individual who spoke only truth found themselves at odds with the powerful comforts of habit and social expectation. They risked the love of friends who valued ease over truth. They jeopardized their standing in public life for the sheer sake of integrity. The price of wisdom was often loneliness, a quiet exile from those who preferred comforting myth to difficult fact. The final battleground, then, became the mind itself. It is shown that the greatest foe does not wear armor or raise a spear. It whispers corrosive doubt and spirals of fear in the sanctuary of consciousness. The student learns to treat the own inner thoughts as raw data, unreliable reports that must be rigorously filtered by reason. Self-talk becomes an internal dialogue, where negative accusations are challenged, one by one, with logic. Fear is merely a prediction of a future misfortune. Understanding this reveals its empty power. Mastery, however, was never achieved in dramatic, life-altering battles. It blossomed instead in the mundane routine of daily choices. How does one respond when the crowded street forces an unexpected delay? When a rival delivers casual, dismissive criticism? The art was not in surviving catastrophic blows, but in making the small, deliberate choice, again and again, to choose reason over anger, patience over flailing frustration. This consistency meant that by the time one faced true crisis, the principles of calm response were already woven into the fabric of action. Eventually, the philosophy ceased to be an academic discipline. It became the very texture of being. The rigorous study gave way to a natural state of equilibrium. There was no longer a forceful effort required to remain composed, only a steady inhabiting of one's inner citadel. The peace wasn't attained by controlling the outer world, but by aligning oneself perfectly with the inevitable flow of reality. To live fully meant embracing the inherent messiness and chaos while remaining internally ordered. The seasoned traveler now looks back at the beginnings, the bustling agoras, the initial flush of uncertainty. He observes the constant human scramble for external validation, watching people treat transient possessions as if they were eternal anchors. The challenges remain remarkably consistent across the centuries. Man still chases shadows, still doubts his own capacity for reasoned judgment. But the inner toolkit has been forged. The knowledge that the self resides behind the curtain of daily roles, that peace is a matter of internal assent rather than external circumstance, remains the most reliable inheritance. The passing of this wisdom does not require grand pronouncements from a tomb, nor a spectacular final lecture delivered before an admiring crowd. It manifests instead in quiet actions. The patient smile offered to the rude vendor, the measured breath taken before answering sharp injustice, the unwavering commitment to one's own truth when it costs dearly. The cycle continues through simple being, a steady, unshakable luminescence that shows others where the true source of strength resides, within the disciplined capacity of the human mind. The marketplace of ancient Athens was a vibrant chaos, a place where life and thought mingled with the scent of spices and sweat. Here, people were defined by their commerce, by their lineage, by the roles they played within the polis. To be a good citizen meant to succeed in these external definitions, to build wealth, to speak eloquently in assembly, or to craft magnificent statues. It was a beautiful structure of meaning, solid and undeniable. But beneath the noise, always beneath the clamor, there stirred a subtle discontent. A whisper questioned if these carefully built identities were truly sufficient. If self-worth could be measured by bronze coins or by the applause of men, was that worth even pursuing? This internal inquiry was dangerous. It challenged the bedrock of communal reality. For society thrives on consensus, and suspicion to consensus is a profound threat. The seeds of doubt required fertile ground, a mind willing to look away from the bustling crowd and confront the quiet question: who am I when no one is watching, and what defines my inherent self? To ask this was not merely academic, it was an act of personal rebellion. It demanded a turning inward that could leave a person isolated and unmoored. It took time for this internal restlessness to bloom into philosophy. A natural life, even when steeped in the intellectual traditions of Athens, often settles into comfortable assumptions. We assume our beliefs are self-evident truths. We assume our routines provide stability. Yet, sometimes the only path forward is through rigorous skepticism, a relentless questioning of what we thought we knew. This quest for truth eventually found its most famous and perhaps most disruptive champion in a man named Socrates. He did not preach from a temple step or write elaborate treatises. His philosophy was conversational. It lived in the tension of dialogue, the shared exchange of ideas under the midday sun. Socrates himself famously claimed ignorance. This wasn't modesty. It was a methodological tool. By declaring that he knew nothing, he put everyone else on notice. They too thought they knew more than they did. He sought not merely answers, but fundamental clarity about the nature of knowledge itself. His life became an unintended seminar in intellectual humility. The brilliance of his method lay in its seemingly simple structure, conversation leading to crisis. He would approach a person, a politician, a craftsman, a philosopher, and simply ask questions. Questions designed not to accuse, but to reveal contradictions. For instance, if you claim to be brave, he might inquire about your definition of fear. If you claim to possess knowledge of justice, he might press on the boundary between law and moral good. The goal was never victory in argument. It was recognition of flawed assumptions. The person who enters his cross-examination feeling confidently informed often leaves bewildered, realizing that their solid pillars of belief were built upon shifting sand. He did not attack the man. He gently interrogated the premises of the man's understanding of himself and the world. This gentle interrogation carried a devastating social power. It revealed something fundamental. Most people are quite certain in matters they barely understand. They mistake familiarity for knowledge, assumption for axiom. And when faced with this universal ignorance, it became clear that true wisdom was not about possessing answers. It was about cultivating the unwavering habit of doubt. The cross-examination, therefore, was less a challenge to individuals and more a painful mirror held up to the entire city. It showed them that the comfortable myths they lived by, the myth of inherited virtue, the myth of expertise, the myth of settled truth, were largely fictional constructs sustained only by habit. This intellectual burden proved heavier than any physical trial. To live in a state of continuous questioning meant discarding certainty. The stable ground beneath one's feet seemed to dissolve into endless possibility and uncomfortable self-doubt. It forced an engagement with the soul itself, recognizing that genuine human mastery began not with controlling outcomes, but with scrutinizing motives. This commitment to relentless self-examination became the defining philosophical discipline of the coming years. The realization that the most dangerous endeavor was simply learning how deeply we are still ignorant. We build our lives upon the shifting sand of what we think matters. We gather external markers, wealth, reputation, adoration, and treat them as if they are bedrock truths. We become obsessed with controlling the world around us, the weather, the favor of a rival, the opinion of the marketplace. This desire to control is perhaps the most exhausting and fundamentally flawed assumption of the human spirit. It leads us into a frantic chase after shadows, where satisfaction always proves just out of reach, dissolving like mist at dawn. We believe that if we simply exert enough will or accumulate enough power, then peace can be secured, that every outcome must bend to our will. We are forever chasing an illusion. The deepest struggle is not with injustice in the city streets, but within the very architecture of our own minds. We have spent so much time focusing on the outer world, measuring our worth against things that do not belong to us, things entirely outside the sphere of our agency. This misplaced focus is where all true suffering originates. Consider the vastness of human effort expended in futile attempts at prediction or manipulation. We try to write fate, to cajole fortune into compliance, believing that if a sequence of events can be mapped out, then misery can be permanently averted. Yet life resists such clean definitions. It is inherently messy, chaotic, and fundamentally indifferent to our careful plans. The realization must begin with an unsettling admission that most things we desperately wish to control are utterly outside our power. This acknowledgement is not a surrender or a lack of ambition. Rather, it is the ultimate act of mental liberation. When we finally concede what lies beyond our command, the actions of others, the passage of time, the caprice of fate, a tremendous amount of internal energy becomes instantly available. That lost energy can then be redirected inward. This journey forces us to look away from the spectacle and toward the self. It demands a brutal honesty about where we have placed our fragile hopes. Are they rooted in solid ground, or are they clinging desperately to the shifting winds of circumstance? The ancient philosophers observed that happiness was not a destination achieved by winning battles or accumulating luxuries. It was an internal condition, remarkably robust, built upon stable foundations. Learning to distinguish between what is within your dominion and what is merely passing through your life is perhaps the single most critical skill for a dignified human existence. Those who resist this difficult separation become prisoners of circumstance, forever reacting to the external world as if it held the key to their contentment. They are slaves to fear, enslaved by the possibility that tomorrow's sun will shine differently, or that the council will judge them wrongly. But what if the source of stability was never outside? What if true security lay in recognizing and cultivating a private fortress, a citadel of mind impervious to external assault? This thought challenges every societal structure built on dependency. It tells us that our truest form of strength comes not from armies or gold, but from an unshakable reasoned judgment regarding the world's limitations. Facing the illusion of control means accepting contingency. It means finding a profound kind of peace in randomness. It is the mental space where what if gives way to given that. This is where our philosophy must guide us, teaching us how to adjust our expectations until they align with reality, and then finding freedom within that aligned vision. It starts with recognizing that while we cannot control events, we always retain absolute jurisdiction over our judgments of those events. The breath we take, the assumption we make, the story we tell ourselves in the silence between thoughts, these things are always ours. Embracing this sovereignty is scary because it means accepting responsibility not just for actions taken, but for the very lens through which all reality passes. And that weight, when finally born, feels less like a burden and more like an immense, quiet freedom. The journey inward had brought a profound, sometimes frightening clarity. After the vigorous questioning of Socrates and the disillusioning realization that much life was spent fighting imaginary battles against things beyond our reach, a quiet exhaustion settled upon the seeker's soul. The noisy marketplace of self-doubt began to fade, replaced by a solemn stillness under the afternoon sun. The next lesson arrived not with a dramatic flourish or a harsh rebuke, but with a gentle warning, the steady voice of wisdom itself. This was Stoicism in its purest form, an understanding that life's greatest struggles are rarely against enemies outside the city walls, but against our own misunderstanding of what truly belongs to us. The fundamental shift required is one of scale. For too long, we have been obsessed with the things we cannot grasp, the favorable weather, the whims of the crowd, the perceived status of a rival. We treat these external elements as if they are the source of our happiness, believing that merely changing our circumstances will bring us peace. But this chapter demands a radical reorientation. The true battleground is not the agora or the battlefield. It is the quiet chamber within the mind. Here, we must confront the pervasive illusion of control. We build intricate palaces of expectation around things, our reputation, our relationships, even our health. And when the foundation of these expectations shakes, the entire self seems threatened by collapse. Acceptance, in this ancient context, is not resignation or apathy. It is far more active than that. To accept reality fully means observing it with clear eyes and naming it exactly as it is, temporary, uncontrollable, and therefore irrelevant to our core virtue. It is the disciplined act of acknowledging what passes through us without allowing it to disturb the inner citadel. Consider a sculptor standing before marble. The marble itself has inherent qualities, its color, its weight, its structure. But the final sculpture does not emerge from an arbitrary desire. It emerges only by removing the excess stone that obscures the intended form. Similarly, the tranquil mind is formed not by accumulating pleasant experiences, but by stripping away the unnecessary attachments and judgments. The naive mind sees adversity as a personal affront, a sign that something is fundamentally wrong with them or their life. The disciplined soul recognizes adversity simply as data. It is an event. It is wind changing direction. It is loss arriving on its own schedule. And because it is merely an event, its power to define our inner state diminishes drastically. This understanding introduces the concept of emotional architecture. We are taught that the most potent source of suffering is not the external difficulty itself, the poverty, the illness, the unjust criticism, but our judgment about that difficulty. We do not suffer from events, we suffer from our resistance to them. The Stoic mind learns to pause between stimulus and response. In that crucial sliver of time, a new freedom blossoms. It is the space where panic can be replaced by reasoned assessment, where anger can give way to measured pity, and where fear dissolves into calm clarity. This ability is not innate, it is rigorously trained. It demands constant practice, like building muscle memory for the soul. The goal is resilience born of acceptance. We are learning to inhabit a state of radical equanimity. The external world will remain chaotic, people will fail, empires will crumble, and natural disaster will strike without warning. But our internal core must become impervious to these tides. This inner life becomes its own reliable ecosystem. Acceptance means understanding the law of nature as fundamentally indifferent to our desires. It suggests that striving against this indifference is the definition of misery. Happiness, therefore, must be redefined not as the peak moment of pleasure, but as the constant state of alignment with reality and reason. It is a quiet harmony achieved when the will ceases its endless struggle against what simply is. The whispers of acceptance are gentle because they do not promise comfort in idleness. They promise fortitude in action. To accept your limitations is to finally free yourself to exert maximum effort within those very limits. We stop blaming fate and start praising the inherent dignity of our own reasoned response. This shift transforms weakness into quiet power, making us master architects of a self that can withstand anything the unpredictable world might throw its way. The citadel stands ready, built not of marble, but of disciplined thought. The lessons of the agora were profound. The quiet turning inward had revealed a landscape more complex and perhaps more frightening than any foreign land. To truly know oneself was to confront the raw, unvarnished truth of one's own fragility and immense potential. You discovered that reputation, wealth, or even physical strength offered no inherent protection against the inevitable chaos of life. The external world proved itself unreliable, a stage upon which fortune played its fickle, dramatic roles. Your mind finally recognized the true source of stability. It was not in managing armies or controlling the tides, but in mastering the judgments that passed through you. Yet, philosophy, for all its quiet power, rarely offers an easy path to peace. The moment a man steps outside the expected boundaries, the predictable comfort of the collective agreement, he finds himself exposed. And society, built upon comforting traditions and established roles, fears exposure above all else. You found yourself standing at the nexus of this great conflict, the integrity of the inner life versus the demands of public opinion. The dilemma presented itself not in a blaze of epic battle, but in the sharp, cold light of necessity. You faced choices where every path demanded sacrifice. To maintain your philosophical truth was to risk ostracization, professional ruin, or even exile. It meant deliberately choosing a difficult, solitary life over one of accepted, if compromised, comfort. This was no mere intellectual exercise. It was an existential crucible. The pressure mounted from all sides. Those who valued the wisdom you found so costly merely saw inconvenience. They expected you to retreat, to cloak your radical insights under layers of conventional compliance. To live in accordance with external expectation felt safer, easier even. But that path meant betraying the hard-won understanding that virtue is its own reward, and has no price tag set by the market or by the city council. This required a brutal internal calculus. You had to decide which self was real, the self the world needed you to be, defined by familial ties or civic ambition, or the true self, forged in the silent crucible of unrelenting self-questioning. The former offered warmth and belonging. The latter demanded cold courage and absolute solitude. The weight of this choice became a constant companion. It was the tension between utility and truth, the philosopher as useful citizen versus the philosopher as solitary guardian of the mind. Every conversation, every public glance seemed to carry unspoken judgment. You found yourself constantly performing an internal negotiation, weighing immediate survival against profound integrity. The initial ease with which you had dismantled assumed knowledge was now reversed. The world did not simply correct your assumptions. It threatened to revoke your right to exist within its bounds. The accusation was subtle but devastating. You were undermining the very foundations of civic life. You were teaching people how to think, and that ability to question was perceived as a threat to order itself. The struggle became less about logic and more about sheer moral endurance. It demanded a resilience not found in physical training, but in the unwavering commitment to one's own principles, even when those principles led directly into suffering. You realized that your highest act of citizenship was not participating in the status quo, but maintaining intellectual freedom within it. The dilemma thus became the ultimate test, choosing between worldly belonging and inner sovereignty. Would you adjust your internal compass? Would you dilute your truth, just to make the social atmosphere tolerable? Or would you hold fast to the difficult clarity of self-knowledge, accepting all that came with it? This was the moment when theory became painful reality. The abstract concepts of apatheia, indifference to external fortune, were no longer academic thought. They became a lifeline against despair and coercion. The philosopher learns quickly that true safety is an internal construct. It cannot be guaranteed by treaties or armed guards, only by the unshakable knowledge of one's own character. The stakes rose beyond merely personal comfort. They touched upon the fate of free thought itself. To compromise was to extinguish the inner flame you had so painstakingly rekindled. And thus, at the critical juncture, the core philosophy asserted itself not as a gentle suggestion, but as a necessary stance. It demanded that you choose the difficult, truthful path, the one where peace is defined by alignment with reason, regardless of how harshly the world might judge the equation. The journey to wisdom is never a straight path. It begins not with an answer, but with the drawing of a line. Everything we believe about freedom, about power, and indeed about ourselves exists across this invisible divide. Look closely at it. This line does not separate matter from spirit or good from evil. It separates influence from indifference. We have spent so long trying to act as if everything were within our grasp. We push against currents we cannot change. We argue over things that belong entirely to chance. The whim of a rival, the passing cloud, the shifting mood of the crowd. This futile struggle is exhausting, leaving us depleted and perpetually resentful. It is the great exhaustion of caring about what others will think or what fortune deems possible. The mentor guides us now to acknowledge the reality of this boundary. To draw it is not a physical act, it is an intellectual surrender. A realization so profound that it changes the very structure of the mind. We must look into our own desires and ask, where exactly does my concern end, and where does the uncontrollable world begin? The initial resistance is fierce. It feels like abandoning a piece of comfortable illusion. If we decide certain things are beyond our reach, the outcome of a battle, the favor of a god, even the life of a loved one, we feel stripped bare. We lose the imagined safety net woven from constant intervention. But here lies the great liberty. By defining this line, we do not become passive observers. Rather, we gain fierce focus. We realize that the only place where human action can truly take root is within our own judgments and intentions. The external world is rich with unpredictable variables. It throws at us storms of criticism, unexpected losses, sudden triumphs, all purely indifferent events. They are merely data points. The power lies in the pause between stimulus and response. When a harsh word strikes you from across the forum, your immediate instinct may be to retaliate, to defend, to argue that they are wrong. But standing on this side of the line, before reacting, we ask, is changing their mind within my control? No. Their thoughts are theirs alone. Instead, our focus pivots entirely inward. The things under our governance become singular and luminous. Our assessment of an event, our decision to respond with measured patience, our commitment to truth even when costly. These internal actions are the only true sources of power, for they are the only places where we have perfect sovereignty. This understanding does not breed coldness. It cultivates a profound, resilient warmth. It is the realization that happiness cannot be secured by maximizing external goods. If you tie your self-worth to things outside yourself, a title, a fortune, another person's approval, you are perpetually vulnerable. The moment those things falter, so does your core sense of self. The dichotomy of control forces us to redefine what strength means. True strength is not the ability to overcome an army or manipulate public opinion. It is the steady internal discipline to remain equanimous when all visible supports are stripped away. It is choosing your internal landscape regardless of the turmoil surrounding you. This process, drawing this line, requires immense self-honesty, bordering on painful indifference. We must practice acknowledging difficult realities, that some losses are inevitable. That effort alone does not guarantee reward. That external forces, no matter how powerful they seem, ultimately operate beyond the reach of human will. This is not despair. It is highly sophisticated acceptance. By mastering this division, we achieve a monumental freedom. We cease spending energy managing outcomes that were never ours to manage in the first place. We save that vital energy for cultivating virtue, for acting justly, speaking truthfully, and exercising reason. The inner citadel is finally defended by an understanding of its sheer limits. Only what arises from our choosing can be truly perfected or damaged. The line drawn here is not a barrier against life. It is the boundary marker that defines where responsible agency begins. It allows us to endure the inevitable chaos of existence without being swept away, building instead an unshakable foundation rooted purely in character and internal resolve. Having navigated the stormy seas of self-discovery, the student now stands on the precipice of true freedom. It is a strange, quiet liberty, far removed from the dramatic pronouncements of the agora or the desperate struggles against fate. The philosophy has moved beyond mere theoretical understanding. It is becoming a way of breathing, a settled rhythm beneath the surface of life. This final stage is not about gaining more knowledge, but achieving a profound lessening, a gentle withdrawal from emotional intensity. We speak now of apatheia, often misunderstood as simple numbness or apathy. To mistake these two concepts is to fundamentally misunderstand the whole journey. Apathy suggests an indifference that is vacant and shallow, while true apatheia is something much deeper. It is freedom from destructive passions. The student has learned that passion itself is not inherently evil. Grief is a natural response to loss. Anger signals injustice. But when these responses become disproportionate, when they hijack reason and dictate action, then they are damaging. They tether the self to external outcomes. The challenge, therefore, becomes cultivating what we might call emotional mastery, not by eliminating feeling, but by mastering our judgment of those feelings. It is the delicate art of observing the emotion without being consumed by it. The ancient understanding understood that most suffering does not originate in the event itself. A setback at the market, a harsh word from a rival, the sudden absence of fortune, these are merely data points. They are neutral inputs into life's flow. Suffering begins when we judge these events as terrible or intolerable or unfair. It is our internal resistance to reality that poisons us. This principle, hammered home through years of self-examination, now demands a level of sustained emotional discipline that feels both revolutionary and utterly natural. The process is akin to observing the weather across a vast expanse. The storms will certainly come, the unexpected illness, the betrayal of a friend, the crushing weight of poverty. They are part of the cyclical nature of existence. But by practicing apatheia, we do not wish for the sun forever. Rather, we cultivate the internal strength to be calm and centered whether under brilliant sunlight or torrential rain. It is radical equanimity in action. This disciplined neutrality does not mean becoming unfeeling toward others. Compassion remains vital. We learn to distinguish between appropriate emotion, the genuine sorrow for a friend's loss, and destructive passion, the paralyzing rage at fate itself. True indifference, then, is merely the refusal to allow external circumstances to dictate our internal state of peace. It is recognizing that inner tranquility resides solely within the voluntary jurisdiction of the self. The journey through this discipline forces one into highly pressurized emotional situations. Consider the unexpected loss of status or wealth. Imagine a sudden blight on crops, plunging a family into desperate poverty. The immediate, raw instinct is fear, despair, and resistance. But the disciplined mind has different tools now. Instead of spiraling into panic, it employs a deep, meditative pause. It forces the question, what am I doing right now that I cannot control? This single query immediately redraws the boundaries of action and redirects energy away from futile worry toward reasoned response. The loss is accepted as fact. The ensuing pain is acknowledged, but not given supreme authority over one's mind. The student faces these tests, sometimes literally in exile, sometimes through prolonged deprivation. They learn to live within the constraints others deem unbearable. The scarcity of resources, the lack of applause, the quiet obscurity that society often labels as failure. Yet here in the stillness, they find a profound and enduring power. This is not Stoicism based on endurance alone. It is a voluntary alignment with nature's rhythm. It is understanding that life unfolds according to inevitable causes and effects, and our wisdom lies in harmonizing with those currents rather than fighting against them. The challenge is consistency. It is easy to adopt this calm demeanor when everything is going well, bathed in the golden light of civic success. But true self-sovereignty, the embodiment of apatheia, is tested when life strips away all comforts. The familiar routines, the expected praise, the security of community. The moment is revealed not through triumph, but through sustained resilience in profound mundane hardship. The philosophical journey has transformed the nature of desire itself. Previously, a good life was defined by accumulation or public acclaim. Now, the student realizes that virtue, self-contained and entirely internal, is the only possession immune to theft and decay. The mind becomes its own fortress, requiring no outer wall but maintaining vigilant practice. This realization culminates in an effortless state of being, one who reacts not with panic or despair, but with measured deliberation. One's choices are always tethered back to this central inquiry. What is truly within my power? And what response can I give that honors my character regardless of the consequence? The ultimate wisdom gained here is a quiet authority. It is the knowledge that the world will continue its chaos, the passions will continue their cyclical nature, but they no longer possess the key to one's inner peace. The self has become unshakable, not in an arrogant defiance, but in a deep, grounded acceptance of reality's ceaseless flow. This state of measured indifference is not emotional vacancy. It is profound and active freedom. The journey of philosophy had taken us far from the comfortable certainty of Athens's established norms. We learned to distrust our first opinions, recognizing that merely believing something was insufficient. True wisdom demanded a continuous testing. Through questioning and through disciplined practice, we discovered that freedom lay not in external success or worldly favor, but in the singular fortress of our own minds. We mastered the art of acceptance, realizing that resistance against what is inevitable only breeds suffering. This understanding led us to draw the critical line, acknowledging the vast ocean of things beyond our power, and focusing solely on the small space of judgment within ourselves. We learned that mere emotional calm was not enough. It had to be an active, disciplined state, an internal citadel capable of weathering any storm. But even with this radical self-mastery achieved, there remained a final frontier, defining what truly constituted a good life. What is virtue if it does not anchor itself to something absolute? Was it simply the absence of vice, or did it require a positive, actionable definition that transcended mere habit? This contemplation led us to confront the very axioms we had constructed about human existence. We had been taught, implicitly and explicitly, that goodness was found in externals, in property, in honor, in reputation, even in fulfilling social roles perfectly. These external markers served as seductive anchors, promising stability in exchange for our attention and ambition. Yet, experience taught us the bitter lesson of transience. Fortune proved itself a fickle mistress, capable of elevating us to heights and then stripping us bare with bewildering speed. We saw powerful men fall from grace. We watched brilliant plans disintegrate under the slightest shift of circumstance. These visible cycles of loss were jarring reminders that everything external was, by definition, unstable. The seeds of doubt began to sprout again. If our lives were defined by things outside us, the glory earned, the friendship maintained, the wealth accumulated, then true security was an illusion, built upon sand and shifting tides. The wise realization became unavoidable. If virtue is indeed internal, then our entire definition of a good life must pivot away from these visible props and toward something incorruptible. It needed to be defined solely by reasoned character. This intellectual shift was not merely theoretical. It demanded an immediate, practical overhaul of value. If we accept that health can vanish, reputation can crumble, and armies can fall, then nothing held in the marketplace or on the battlefield should hold ultimate philosophical weight. Virtue, therefore, could no longer be a collection of practiced habits. It had to become its own absolute criterion for the good life. The transition from opinion to axiom was profound. An opinion is what we currently accept as true, often based on comfort or social pressure. An axiom, by contrast, is a foundational truth, a premise so self-evident and necessary that it cannot logically be questioned. We were compelled to elevate our understanding of the good from mere observed habit into an undeniable philosophical law governing human action. This meant defining virtue not as simply avoiding bad actions, but as actively pursuing a specific kind of internal excellence. The deepest realization was this: the primary good is entirely self-sufficient and lies exclusively in the quality of judgment itself. The soul's alignment with reason became the sole purpose worthy of pursuit. Everything else, power, pleasure, even basic survival, could only be considered indifferent things. They might be preferred, or they might be obstacles, but they did not contribute to our inherent moral standing. Our character was our ultimate currency, impervious to economic collapse or political upheaval. This new definition placed an intense burden on the individual. It meant that every minor choice, every quiet moment of reflection, carried immense weight. The goal shifted from mere survival to flourishing based purely on reasoned judgment. We were no longer striving for acceptance within a society defined by shifting power dynamics. We were aiming for a state of self-contained moral architecture. The implications of this axiom were dizzying and frightening. To live by such pure internal standards meant sacrificing the easy camaraderie of pretense. It meant refusing to play the social game simply because it was expected, regardless of the personal cost. The old life, comfortable though it had been, suddenly felt like a meticulously crafted stage set for a drama that no longer held any truth for us. The ultimate freedom arrived at this precipice, the understanding that by defining virtue internally, by making reasoned judgment the supreme good, we achieved self-sovereignty. We became masters of our inner landscape first, and only then could we navigate the external one with unshakable confidence. This was not merely a philosophical concept. It was an existence lived moment to moment, demanding continuous assent to the primacy of reason over all other perceived goods. It was the quiet rebellion against every assumption, culminating in a radical declaration that the most valuable thing any person possesses is simply their capacity for examined thought and moral will. And that capacity must be relentlessly nurtured above all else. The journey inward had been a long passage. We learned that life was not merely about surviving the day, but about constructing an inner fortress against the inevitable storms of fate. By mastering what we could control and accepting what we could not, we found a brittle but undeniable peace. Yet, such profound knowledge rarely comes without consequence. The quiet certainty forged by philosophy is inherently dangerous in the bustling marketplace of human affairs. The wisdom achieved through years of rigorous self-inquiry did not grant immunity from the world's harsh judgment. In fact, it often seemed to amplify our visibility, turning us into beacons for both admiration and resentment. Because we were no longer susceptible to the shallow gratifications of status, gold, or public approval, others viewed our tranquility not as mastery, but as an inexplicable withdrawal, a kind of defiance. We had learned that true freedom was predicated on choosing one's internal response over conforming to external expectation. But choice, especially when it is consistently directed away from the comforting path of least resistance, has a palpable cost. It demands sacrifices. Friends who prefer comfortable delusion to difficult truth, professional circles who require unquestioning agreement, and even families whose love is conditional upon performance. The conviction we held was not merely an opinion. It was an axiom built on sleepless nights of questioning and the acceptance of our own finitude. To hold that inner line, the boundary between what is truly ours and what belongs to fate or others' whims, was to stand apart, exposed on a philosophical precipice. Consider the nature of conviction itself. It is a powerful shield, but also an unnatural spotlight. When you truly believe that your worth rests solely on your character, when you genuinely view reason as the highest good and external praise as mere noise, you fundamentally alter your standing within society. You cease playing the established game, and others recoil from those who refuse to participate in illusion. The consequence was not singular. It manifested in many forms: quiet withdrawal, public confrontation, or simply a gradual, unsettling alienation. Those who had been once pillars of our social life found themselves questioning our judgment, suggesting that perhaps we had become too austere, too removed from the practical necessities of life's usual compromises. They whispered that wisdom was cumbersome, a heavy mantle to wear in the warmth of collective agreement. They suggested that maybe a little compromise, a willingness to simply play along with accepted norms, would restore us to our natural place within the human flow. The seduction of conformity was powerful. It promised inclusion and ease in exchange for intellectual integrity. Yet we knew better. We had seen the architecture of happiness crumble when built upon such shifting sand. We understood that any peace bought through fundamental lie was merely a beautiful form of spiritual cowardice. The cost of conviction became less about grand, dramatic banishment, though those threats often loomed large enough to fill the imagination, and more subtle. It was the daily tax paid on one's relationships, the constant necessity of explaining why certain trivial matters genuinely did not bother us, and the exhaustion that comes from perpetually defending a quiet internal revolution. The true measure of this cost, however, lay in the emotional toll it took upon the self. To maintain such rigorous intellectual standards required an absolute refusal to accept easy answers, a refusal that is psychologically draining over decades. One must remain vigilant, forever guarding against slippage back into old habits of assumption and comfortable belief. It was a perpetual balancing act, remaining utterly convinced of one's philosophical truth while simultaneously navigating the messy, contradictory demands of human existence. We learn to recognize that sometimes conviction means accepting solitude, not as punishment, but as a chosen vantage point from which to view the world with unflinching clarity. The weight of this knowledge was profound. It demanded a constant calibration of spirit, being ready to explain our uncompromising moral framework without becoming trapped in endless argument, and knowing when the silence itself was the most eloquent defense of one's core beliefs. We realized that living truthfully is not always palatable. Sometimes it simply makes us inconvenient, and so we continued. The commitment was no longer a study or an endeavor, but simply a state of being, a quiet insistence on the primacy of reason within the heart and mind. This unwavering adherence to reasoned judgment, even when facing social exclusion or outright hostility, is perhaps the most profound and continuous labor any human spirit can undertake. It remains the ultimate cost and the singular reward, the enduring sovereignty of the self. For years, the quest for truth had led us through public forums and the grand arenas of human conflict. We learned to draw lines between what we could influence and what remained utterly beyond our grasp. We built a mighty inner citadel, strong enough to withstand external storms, indifference to fortune's harsh judgments, and the weight of public scorn. Yet, even with the outer world manageable, the true battlefield was found at home, behind the curtain of the mind itself. The enemy here is not an empire or a rival. It is our own relentless chatter. The greatest challenges are not those imposed by others, but those generated within us. The whispers of fear, the echoes of self-doubt, the demanding chorus that insists on constant validation. Philosophy teaches us how to treat external chaos, yet it often fails to give us a precise method for silencing the internal noise. This next stage is perhaps the most treacherous, mastering the discourse of one's own mind. We must understand that the human mind, left untamed, is not a peaceful sanctuary. It is a noisy bazaar. It rings with accusations from past failures and rehearses catastrophic scenarios concerning future mistakes. We gather judgments, sudden flares of anger, sinking dread, biting resentment, and treat them as if they were facts of nature, immutable truths that must be faced. But these thoughts are merely fleeting opinions, specters dressed in the robes of certainty. The old wisdom gave us tools for external action: acceptance when a ship sinks, composure when a man speaks wrongly, equanimity before poverty's chill. But how do we remain steady when the mind itself is pitching wildly? How do we separate raw emotional reaction from reasoned judgment? Consider the habitual thought pattern. A minor inconvenience, a missed appointment, a sudden snub in the market, the unexpected delay of transport can cascade into a major inner crisis. The noise begins with a simple assumption. This must be wrong. I should not be delayed. This disrespects me. Therefore, my worth is diminished by this event. The philosophical task here becomes one of constant interception. We must catch the thought before it gains momentum, before it hardens into belief. It requires recognizing that simply having a negative thought does not make it true. Similarly, positive thoughts do not guarantee happiness if they are built on fragile external pillars. This is where reason acts as a disciplined sentinel. When the mind descends into circular worrying, replaying arguments we wish we could unmake or scenarios we can never control, reason must step in with gentle, relentless skepticism. It asks, is this worry useful? Does dwelling on this loss change the inevitable outcome? What evidence do I have that this fear is grounded in reality and not merely built from a pile of historical what-ifs? The process is an inner dialectic, a constant cross-examination of our own assumptions. When we feel the familiar tightening in the chest, the subtle physical marker of anxiety, we must pause. We do not argue with the feeling, we observe it. We become detached observers standing outside the immediate rush of judgment, treating the raw emotion like a phenomenon, something that happens to us, but which does not define who we fundamentally are. This discipline is often mistaken for emotional flattening, but this misunderstanding could not be further from the truth. Mastering the mind's noise is not about becoming numb. It is about cultivating freedom of response. It means choosing how much weight to give a passing impression. We learn that our freedom lies precisely in the gap, the space between the stimulus and the reply. The roaring thoughts, the anxieties demanding immediate resolution, they are merely sound waves vibrating within the mind's chamber. Our task is to teach ourselves to live within silence, to let those powerful sounds pass without engaging them, without letting them hijack our core sense of self-worth or peace. It demands a profound shift from reactivity to measured response. The struggle with internal dialogue reveals the heart of human imperfection. We believe that if we simply think harder, if we just try to be calm, the noise will cease. But the mind resists such brute force effort. The mastery is quiet. It is built in countless small moments. The conscious decision not to escalate a disagreement, the moment you choose observational curiosity over immediate judgment about another person's faults. It is finding peace not by eliminating thought, but by perfecting the relationship with thought itself. The disciplined mind becomes reliable. It becomes the constant factor, unshaken by the drama of external life. The internal dialogue transforms from a cage of self-limitation into a training ground for continuous self-governance. This is the ultimate sovereignty, knowing that while fate may dictate the events we encounter, it cannot dictate the nature of our response. We become masters not only of circumstance, but most profoundly of ourselves. The grand struggle for the self, the battle against external chaos, seemed an endless ascent. We had learned that true freedom resided not in acquiring goods or power, but within the quiet fortress of our own minds. The challenge was no longer merely to understand philosophy, it was to inhabit it completely. This meant moving from profound theory into the granular reality of everyday life, the way one chooses to endure a slow traffic jam, how one responds when slighted by a casual remark, or how one meets the unexpected delay that unravels perfect plans. Mastery, we realized, is not always found in epic confrontation or dramatic exile. It resides instead in the accumulation of countless small choices. Think of it as the resilience woven into the very fabric of routine existence. We had spent years training our minds to identify the line between what belonged to us and what did not. We learned that external events, whether a cruel word or a sudden setback, were merely data, raw inputs devoid of inherent suffering. The true source of distress was always our internal assent to those events. It was the judgment we layered upon the occurrence. To achieve deep inner peace meant constantly refusing to validate irrational fear, uncontrollable anger, or panicked anticipation regarding futures that might never arrive. And so, the rigorous practice moved inward again, focusing on the micro moments. The philosophy shed its monumental scope and became intimately small. It demanded attention during a mundane walk through the agora, where one must choose whether to allow the irritating noise of commerce or careless chatter to disturb one's settled calm. It challenged us when facing a critical gaze from a stranger whose judgment was fundamentally uninformed. These moments are not tests of grand will, but subtle checkpoints for the soul. Consider the simple act of waiting. Waiting in line for water, waiting for an answer, waiting for a beloved person to arrive late. In these forced pauses, our natural human inclination is often resistance, a silent internal complaint against the disruption of expectation. But here lies the opportunity. The moment of delay becomes a pure testing ground for one's present understanding. Instead of railing against the lateness or the inconvenience, we must choose radical acceptance. We practice viewing the wait itself as an empty canvas upon which our calm disposition can be painted. This refusal to engage in internal protest is a small act of immense philosophical gravity. The discipline teaches us to observe these routines without judgment, not of ourselves, but of the situation. We notice the urge to multitask, the tendency to fill silence with unnecessary chatter, or the quick spike of resentment when plans falter. These observations are not points of failure. They are mere data points for self-correction. They show where the habit of external attachment still lingers. This process is repetitive and utterly unglamorous. There is no single moment that will grant ultimate freedom. It is the steady, day after day, choice to respond with reasoned composure rather than immediate emotional reaction. It is choosing patience in a world that prizes speed, or clarity over convenience. It is realizing that the cumulative weight of these small, conscious decisions forms an impenetrable shield, a resilience built brick by ordinary brick. The strength required here is not the heroic fortitude displayed before armies or political leaders. It is quieter, more persistent. It is the inner muscle memory developed through countless tiny repetitions. When something irritates me, I pause and ask, what part of this slight can I genuinely control? When I feel frustration mounting because a task stalls, I remind myself that my mastery lies only in how I choose to occupy this moment of stasis. This is the profound realization that makes living philosophy so difficult: its ubiquity. The training does not end with understanding theory. It integrates into the very flow of breath and action. It becomes a subtle internal dialogue, constantly intercepting the impulse to react immediately, replacing it instead with measured deliberation. We are mastering the interval, the infinitesimal gap between stimulus and response. In that space resides our true sovereignty. The goal is not emotional blandness, it is vibrant autonomy. We seek not to eliminate feeling, but to divorce our sense of self-worth from those feelings. To feel anger when wronged, yet refusing to let that anger dictate future actions. To feel disappointment at loss, yet understanding that internal virtue remains unaffected by the magnitude of the void. This continuous pattern of small, conscious choices, choosing reason over reflex, accepting reality instead of resisting it, is the daily forging of character. The philosophy transforms from a set of remarkable teachings into an elemental way of being. We begin to see how every moment carries its own miniature ethical weight. A measured response in anger is a triumph equal in value to standing against tyranny. Enduring delay with grace is mastering a difficulty that many mistake for mere inconvenience. By cultivating this mundane, unwavering composure, we build not just resilience, but a profound and unshakable self-possession that no external force can dismantle. The training never ended at the edge of an arena or under the shadow of a great public pronouncement. It did not conclude with a single, dramatic epiphany. Instead, it began the slow, quiet process of dissolving the self into its fundamental principles. The philosopher learned that wisdom was not a destination to be reached, nor was it a theory to be recited at a feast. True philosophy, he realized, was merely the art of returning, the unflinching return to one's own character. The life he now lived had become itself the ultimate treatise. He moved through the marketplace, no longer seeking dramatic encounters or profound confirmations. The wisdom gained from decades of introspection settled into a natural state of being, like the steady rhythm of breath in deep contemplation. His demeanor was marked not by aloofness, but by a profound and quiet self-possession. Every small interaction became an opportunity for practice, a miniature stage upon which he would reenact his commitment to reasoned judgment. Consider the simple moment, waiting for water from a public fountain, or navigating the clamor of the agora during market hours. Previously, these moments had been invisible stressors, background noise against the drama of deep thought. Now they became vivid teaching moments. The sudden burst of shouting, the frustration of delay, the petty quarrel over price, each was analyzed instantly, stripped bare not as an annoyance, but as pure data. Data regarding human frailty and the fleeting nature of circumstance. The internal citadel, once conceptualized through diagram or drawn line in the dust, was now inhabited reality. Whenever impatience threatened to bloom into irritation, he would simply perform a subtle mental pause. This gap, infinitesimally small yet infinitely valuable, became his sanctuary. In that space, he questioned, what is actually happening? Is this inconvenience harming my core reason? Can I respond with reasoned composure, even if the situation demands quick anger? The answer was always yes. This process of constant, low-key vigilance was exhausting in a way unlike any physical labor. It demanded emotional neutrality without becoming dullness. He learned to observe the currents of emotion, the sudden surge of envy watching another's passing success, the anxious whisper worrying about tomorrow's uncertainty, without becoming swept away by them. The emotions were seen as mere weather patterns passing through the mind, visible but utterly detached from the solid structure of his self-governance. The hardest part was the internalization of indifference. It was not a cold rejection of humanity or life's inherent drama. Rather, it was a refined appreciation that true contentment derived only from alignment with nature and reason. To be genuinely indifferent to external praise meant one could continue helping friends without expecting gratitude. To be indifferent to poverty meant accepting the current material reality while maintaining inner dignity. It was an active choice of internal focus over passive resignation. He understood that many people did not fail because they were challenged, but because they treated philosophy as a temporary hobby, something reserved for quiet evenings and academic debates. They expected revelation, Instead, they received relentless practice. The realization struck them slowly. The philosopher must live through the challenge, using it as fuel for continuous self-improvement. And so, he continued his quiet walk. He walked among citizens still struggling under the weight of misplaced passion, those who measured success by the richness of their robes or the volume of their public acclaim. They lived lives governed by external metrics, reputation, accumulation, the whims of the crowd. Meanwhile, he walked lightly, carrying within himself a self-contained source of calm, a quiet sovereignty that required no affirmation from the city around him. This was not a performance for others. It was the maintenance of a radical internal contract with his own reason. He had stripped away the comforting myths, the societal expectations, and even the notion of what happiness should look like. What remained was simply virtue, the continuous alignment of will and intellect. It meant accepting that life itself would continue to throw setbacks, slights, and profound difficulties at him. These obstacles were not punishments. They were merely instructional tools. They were the curriculum for a lifetime commitment to self-mastery. The return was unflinching because turning inward revealed no soft landing. It demanded constant rigor. He had traded the comforting illusion of external control for the difficult, yet infinitely stable, ground of internal truth. And in that trade, he found not merely peace, but an unbreakable kind of freedom. The profound liberty to be fully present and totally unburdened by what was beyond his rational grasp. It is a curious thing to look back, to observe the passage of years from this quiet vantage point. If one were to trace the arc of knowledge, the initial impulse was often defined by external expectation. We began with the comfortable hum of consensus, believing that our worth lay in roles ascribed by the city, in the accolades bestowed upon public achievement. Our understanding of self was a map drawn by others, but the whispers started subtly enough, questioning those established lines. They questioned whether the definition we accepted, be it as citizen, merchant, or philosopher, was truly sufficient to contain the whole truth of our being. The journey itself proved an unfolding dismantling of certainty. We learned that knowledge was not a fixed possession, but a continuous process of inquiry. We discovered the sheer weight of universal ignorance, realizing through questioning that even those most confident in their wisdom merely possessed expertly articulated assumptions. This initial discomfort with doubt felt dangerous. It challenged the very scaffolding of polite society and predictable order. We were drawn into the deep current of self-interrogation, a process so radical it seemed to unravel our fundamental attachments. The greatest lesson was not what we gained, but what we gave up. The comfort of simple answers. We learned that attempting to govern every external whim, the fickle opinion of the crowd, the unpredictable movement of fortune, the will of another man, was not mastery at all. It was merely exhausting oneself chasing shadows in an endless marketplace. True freedom, we found, resided entirely within the boundaries of our own minds. The world outside remained chaotic and indifferent. We could never control the weather, nor the betrayal of a friend, nor the inevitable decline that touches every great thing. These external factors were merely data points. They held no intrinsic moral power until we judged them to be so. This realization was revolutionary. By acknowledging what lay utterly beyond our reach, we did not feel diminished. We felt radically expanded. The practice of acceptance soon became the bedrock of resilience. It is important to understand that this acceptance was never passive resignation. To accept reality was an active, strenuous choice, a daily refusal to fight the inevitable flow of things merely because it disappointed one's hopes or threatened one's established narrative. The mind, we learned, must become its own unyielding citadel. When a difficult event struck, our first instinct was often resistance, followed by emotional turmoil. But through rigorous practice, we mastered the pause, that essential space between a stimulus and our eventual response. This pause is where sovereignty resides. The stakes grew higher than mere internal calm. We faced genuine dilemmas of conscience, moments where intellectual integrity clashed violently with the pressing need for social survival. To speak truth was not merely to hold an opinion. It was often to invite ostracization, perhaps even exile. The choice became agonizing. Would one sacrifice reasoned conviction for temporary comfort, or endure the isolation necessary to uphold the demanding standard of genuine self-mastery? We came to understand that true citizenship meant intellectual sovereignty, a commitment to reason over popularity. The conceptual framework solidified into a clean division. There is what we can influence, and there is what remains entirely external. This dichotomy provided not a sense of hopelessness, but an immense psychological release. It redirected all our frantic energy inward. We stopped wasting precious mental resources trying to manage the tides of other men's judgments or the capriciousness of fate. All effort was focused on refining judgment itself, the internal filter through which we processed raw data. The mastery extended further into the emotional life, toward what some call equanimity. This was not a deadening numbness, but rather a profound freedom from destructive passions. We separated true calm from shallow indifference. The point was this: when stripped of fortune and comfort, when faced with genuine loss or scarcity, the inner self must remain whole. Our virtue became our only reliably owned possession. It is the only constant in a life otherwise subject to entropy. This understanding forced a relentless redefinition of good. We peeled away all the superficial accoutrements that society might use to define success: wealth, reputation, political power. Instead, we anchored ourselves to a single axiom: reason and reasoned judgment are inherently good. This became our unshakable internal gold standard. To be a truly virtuous life was simply to live in accordance with what is rational, regardless of whether the masses approved or if history records it favorably. The weight of this knowledge could not be overstated. Every philosophical breakthrough came with an implicit tax, a personal cost. Holding the dangerous truth meant living on the periphery, understood by few and admired by even fewer. It required constant mental labor, a daily defense against the subtle pull toward mediocrity, which is often dressed up in the clothes of acceptance. We learned that cultivating wisdom demanded accepting solitude, for it is there, away from the applause and the comforting noise of consensus, that one truly hears the quiet voice of reason. The final stage was realizing that philosophy could not be confined to academic discussion or reasoned contemplation alone. It had to bleed into every mundane corner of life. Mastery was not reserved for grand philosophical breakthroughs. It was found waiting in traffic, while awaiting a delayed friend, when confronted by an unexpected slight. The genius of the discipline is its refusal to let the practitioner rest. Every small interaction became a training ground, a chance to choose composure over irritation and acceptance over resentment. The journey concludes not with a glorious proclamation, but with a quiet integration. We no longer practice philosophy, we simply are it. The mind has developed an automatic, subtle pause before reacting. Impatience becomes curiosity, worry dissipates into mindful observation. The inner dialogue is no longer a battleground, but rather a well-maintained orchard, where seeds of reason consistently bloom. This quiet sovereignty, This ability to hold one's reasoned judgment intact while the external world roars and shifts around you is the true legacy. It is an echo that suggests doubt remains necessary, for absolute certainty breeds complacency, yet it whispers also of an enduring capacity for inner peace, a resilience forged in the fires of relentless questioning. We have not solved life, but we have built ourselves sturdy enough to live within its persistent complexity. The journey toward the truth was never meant to end in a single triumphant speech or a heroic moment of public defiance. Instead, it unfolded into something far more subtle, quieter, and enduring, a quiet inheritance. The true measure of a philosophy was not found etched on marble monuments or bellowed from a rostrum. It lived instead in the stillness of routine, in the measured pace of footsteps crossing an olive tree-shaded path. Having mastered the difficult art of self-mastery, understanding that internal peace belonged only to the mind itself, one learns that wisdom is less a destination and more a continuous state of being. This was the realization that marked the passing of the torch. The philosophy must become invisible, woven into the very fabric of daily existence. The old cycle appeared ready to repeat itself. New generations arrived in the marketplace, filled with bright eyes and the intoxicating belief that the answers to life's great questions still lay outside themselves, in a lawgiver, a prophet, or a rediscovered text. They sought grand pronouncements, dramatic revelations, another authoritative voice to tell them how to live. But the one who had walked the path understood better. The knowledge acquired was too fragile, too profound, and too deeply personal to be packaged for public consumption. It risked dilution, it risked misunderstanding, and worse, it risked demanding worship. To truly carry this legacy meant mastering silence. It meant allowing the wisdom gleaned from years of rigorous internal struggle, the constant questioning, the drawing of invisible lines between what was under our control and what lay outside, to become a simple, natural way of moving through the world. The principles of accepting fate, understanding that suffering arises solely from faulty judgment, and locating virtue entirely within character proved to be profound enough that they required no external declaration. They simply needed continuous practice. Consider the simplicity of this new existence. A man waiting for a cart laden with olives at the market junction. His mind does not race toward speculation about his lunch or his rival's success. Instead, it performs a quiet inventory. Is there any judgment here that causes unnecessary friction? If I feel impatience because the wagon delays, I remind myself that my reaction to the delay, and not the delay itself, is what constitutes the inconvenience. This small pause becomes a fortress, an instant enactment of the citadel mind. These moments were the true proving ground. They tested whether the understanding of the dichotomy of control had settled deep enough to withstand the minutiae of everyday life. Could one maintain radical equanimity while navigating the petty frustrations of human interaction? Was it possible to remain intellectually free, even when confronted with social pressures to conform or flatter? The answer lay in recognizing that indifference to externals was not emotional numbness. Rather, it was a powerful act of self-preservation, a declaration that nothing external had the authority to diminish one's inner peace. The responsibility of this quiet life is immense. It demands continuous vigilance against complacency and the subtle slide back into old habits of reactive thought. The danger in wisdom is not its discovery, but its maintenance. It requires constant intellectual rigor, viewing every minor setback, a poorly worded critique, a financial loss, an unexpected disappointment, not as a punishment or an aberration, but merely as raw data. These events are nothing more than lessons, perfectly delivered, if inconveniently timed. This internalized approach means that the individual becomes their own teacher, their own opponent, and their own most loyal student. The dialogue shifts entirely inward, questioning past judgments, preempting future worries, and accepting present reality without argument. It is a daily negotiation with one's own formidable mind, a ceaseless effort to observe fear and desire merely as passing thoughts, like clouds across the sky of consciousness, rather than identifying with them. The ultimate goal was not reputation, glory, or even wisdom itself. The goal was sovereignty, to live life entirely anchored by reasoned judgment, to possess a moral core so strong and rational that no public approval, nor private hardship, could shake its foundations. This self-possession became the quiet legacy, the demonstration of an inner life robust enough to withstand the wildest storms of human fortune. The torch was not passed through words. It was passed through embodiment. The knowledge was embodied in a steady gaze, a measured breath before responding to injustice, and the ability to find profound richness and acceptance in moments others deemed ordinary or regrettable. It meant recognizing that philosophy is not a doctrine to be believed, but an operating system for life, a constant process of refinement. The quiet life became the most radical statement of all, that true freedom requires nothing more than oneself, guided by reason and unwavering acceptance. And so,